the Whispering Ruins. Long before the first settlers ever set foot on the shores of what would become America, there were those who came before them, leaving behind nothing but strange and haunting remnants, ruins, carvings, and abandoned towns that whispered stories into the wind. Stories that no one could truly understand. Some called it the Lost Civilization, a people who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only riddles and stone, half-forgotten names, and echoes that still linger in the air even now. It was in the deep, shadowed valleys of the American Southwest where these stories were most common. The old folk in the villages spoke of them, elderly men and women who had been raised on tales passed down through generations, tales of a place buried in time, long before the first settlers made their way westward. A place where strange happenings had occurred, a land where time itself seemed to have been swallowed by the earth. The village of Silverstone, nestled beneath the jagged peaks of the Black Mountain Range, was where the tales of the lost civilization began. The town had always been a place where things happened in the dark, things that couldn't be explained. Old folks would sit by the fire in the evening, their faces drawn tight with the weight of the stories they carried. They would tell of the time when the earth had spoken, when the land had shifted, and a great people disappeared, leaving nothing behind but stone markers and eerie silence. It was said that deep in the canyon beyond the edge of Silverstone, a vast city of stone stood, half buried and forgotten by the modern world. Some said it was built by a civilization that had never been known to anyone, their names erased, their language unknown. The city was said to be full of magnificent structures, with carvings on the walls that no one could decipher, strange symbols and messages that told of a people who had mastered knowledge and power beyond imagination. One night, a young man named Samuel Miller, newly arrived to Silverstone, heard the old folks' stories and grew curious. Samuel had always been a dreamer, a wanderer who found comfort in the unknown. He was the kind of man who sought the hidden truths of the world, the forgotten places, the mysteries that only the bravest dared to approach. And so he set out, determined to find the lost city and discover what had happened to its people. On his second day in Silverstone, Samuel met a man who seemed to know more about the lost civilization than most. This man, Ezekiel, was a trapper who had lived in the area for decades. His skin was weathered, his hair long and tangled, and his eyes always seemed to flicker with an unsettling intensity. Ezekiel didn't speak much to strangers, but something about Samuel's curiosity seemed to draw him in. "You're headed for the canyon, aren't you?" Ezekiel asked, his voice low and gravelly, like the wind rustling through dry leaves. Samuel hesitated, but the pull of the story was too strong. "Yes, I am. The city, the ruins. I have to see them." Ezekiel's gaze grew colder. He looked around as if to make sure no one else was listening, and then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Many have gone looking for it. They say the city calls to those who are meant to find it. But there's something you need to know." His eyes darted nervously as he spoke. "The land isn't kind to those who aren't prepared. The city, it doesn't want to be found. And those who search for it, sometimes they never come back." Samuel laughed nervously, thinking the old man was just speaking of the dangers of wild terrain, the natural perils of the canyon. But Ezekiel was serious, his face pale under the weathered skin. "You'll find strange things, things that don't make sense. A place where the night is colder than it should be, where the wind carries voices, whispers from the past. Some say the city was abandoned because they angered something, some power that was far too great. Others say they disappeared because they simply vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself." Samuel's curiosity burned brighter, but a small chill crept up his spine. "What do you mean vanished?" he asked. Ezekiel didn't answer right away. His eyes seemed lost in thought, distant. Then he spoke, but his voice was soft, almost as if speaking to himself. "They say the people who once lived there were different. They weren't like any tribe or people known today. They came from somewhere far off, from lands beyond the mountains, beyond the great river. Some say they came from the stars, guided by forces unknown, and built the city in a place of great power. But then they vanished, and in their place something else came, something dark, something that lingers in the canyon even now." Samuel felt a growing unease in his chest. But he was determined. He needed to see it for himself. He couldn't ignore the call. That afternoon, Samuel packed his gear, water, food, a compass, and his journal. He had heard enough to keep his mind sharp, but the mystery was too alluring to resist. As he made his way toward the canyon, the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long, strange shadows across the landscape. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to thicken. The wind had picked up, and it felt like something was moving just beyond his reach, something waiting. The entrance to the canyon was narrow, a deep cut in the earth, like a scar carved by time itself. The air grew colder as he descended, and soon the warmth of the sun seemed far away, replaced by an oppressive, unnatural chill that wrapped around his shoulders like a heavy cloak. As he ventured deeper into the canyon, the landscape shifted, the rocks growing more jagged and imposing. Strange carvings appeared on the walls, symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light. It was as if the stone itself was alive, telling stories of people long gone. The ground beneath his feet felt different too, soft, almost like it was absorbing his steps. The whispers began, faint at first, like the wind itself was speaking. Samuel stopped. He listened. "You should leave." The voice was faint, like a breath in the wind. He spun around, but there was no one there. Just the shifting rocks and the endless shadows. The whispers grew louder. "You are not welcome here." A cold wind howled through the canyon, and for the first time, Samuel felt the full weight of the place. It was as if the very air itself was alive, breathing, watching. He pushed forward, the echoes of the whispers trailing him, urging him to turn back. But then, through the gloom, he saw it, just beyond the next bend in the canyon. A massive stone archway, ancient and covered in strange symbols. The city was beyond it. He had found it. And there, in the distance, standing under the shadow of the archway, he saw them. Figures, tall and dressed in robes of strange, iridescent material. Their faces were hidden, but their eyes, they glowed, glowing with an unearthly light, watching him. Samuel froze. The figures didn't move, but their presence was undeniable. They were waiting for him, watching him, their eyes burning into his soul. And then the whispers returned, louder than ever. "You should not have come. The price has already been paid." As the wind picked up, the earth beneath Samuel's feet began to tremble, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. The figures began to move toward him, their feet barely touching the ground. Their glowing eyes never left him, and as they approached, the air grew colder still, colder than he had ever felt. The ground shook, the whispering voices now deafening in his ears. Samuel's heart raced, and he realized with a sinking feeling, he had stepped into something much larger than he could ever understand. Something ancient, something powerful. And as the figures reached out toward him, his vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to twist. And then, darkness. The lost voices. Samuel awoke with a start, his head throbbing, his body pressed against cold stone. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and ancient dust. His eyes fluttered open, but the world around him was a blur, dark, oppressive, as if the very landscape had swallowed him whole. His breath came in sharp gasps, his heart racing as he pushed himself up from the ground. His hands scraped against the cold, jagged rock, and he quickly realized he was no longer in the canyon. He wasn't even sure where he was. The last thing he remembered was the glowing eyes of the figures and the feeling of being swallowed by the earth itself. He tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, unsteady. The ground under him felt strange, uneven, as if it was shifting beneath his feet. His hands touched something, soft, almost like fabric, and as he looked down he saw that he was kneeling on a stone floor, covered with strange patterns, symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with an unnatural light. His heart skipped a beat as he looked around, his eyes widening. He was no longer in the canyon. No, this place was far different. It was like a vast underground chamber, its walls made of smooth, polished stone, adorned with intricate carvings that stretched up to the ceiling, where the light flickered like the last remnants of a dying flame. The air was thick, oppressive, and the whispers, they were back. Not just faint this time, but loud, echoing off the stone walls, wrapping around him like a sinister lullaby. "You shouldn't have come." Samuel spun around, his pulse racing. But there was no one there. Just the faint flicker of light, the strange markings on the walls, and the unearthly whispers that seemed to be coming from everywhere, from the very stone itself. He reached for his journal instinctively, but it was gone. His pack, his compass, even the knife he had brought, all were nowhere to be found. It was as if he had been stripped of everything he had carried, left alone in this ancient, forgotten place. The whispers were growing louder now, swirling around him, almost too loud to bear. His ears rang with the voices, all speaking at once, too many to understand, but their message was clear. "Leave, before it is too late." He stumbled backward, his feet skidding on the smooth stone floor, until he collided with something. Turning quickly, he saw an enormous stone archway, its surface covered with more of those strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, watching him, waiting for something. He had to leave. But where could he go? The chamber seemed endless, its walls stretching high above him, and the whispers, now insistent and panicked, seemed to block any thoughts of escape. Then through the darkness a figure appeared. At first, Samuel thought it was just another trick of the light, another shadow cast by the flickering ethereal glow that seemed to haunt the room. But as the figure stepped forward, he realized it was real, a man tall with a dark cloak draped over his shoulders. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and his presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Samuel's voice caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, to ask who this was, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, the figure raised a hand, and the air seemed to grow colder still. You seek the answers, but you cannot comprehend them. The voice was deep, resonant, and carried a weight that seemed to shake the very foundation of the chamber. The figure stepped closer, and Samuel could feel the pull of the air around him, the gravity of this man's presence making it harder to breathe, harder to think. What is this place? Samuel finally managed to ask, his voice trembling. The figure tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he spoke, his voice both ancient and filled with sorrow. This is the place they left behind. The city of the forgotten ones. The lost civilization, as you call it. But it is not a place to be found, it is a place to be remembered. And those who seek it must pay the price. Samuel's heart raced. He had found it. He had found the lost city, the place the old folks had warned him about. But it wasn't what he had imagined. It wasn't a city full of riches or knowledge. It was something much darker, a place caught between the living and the dead, between time and eternity. Who are you? Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure did not answer right away. Instead, he gestured to the walls around them, and Samuel turned to follow his motion. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and change, moving before his very eyes, rearranging themselves into shapes, into faces. Faces of people, men and women, their expressions twisted in sorrow, their eyes filled with fear. I was one of them, the figure finally said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. One of the people who built this city, who lived here in harmony with the earth and the stars. We knew secrets, secrets that could shape the world, that could change the very fabric of time. But we did not understand the cost. The figure stepped forward again, his movements graceful, almost fluid, like the shadows themselves were part of him. We paid the price. And now we are all that remains. Samuel took a step back, his mind racing. He felt the weight of the figure's words, the terrifying realization that the lost civilization had not vanished. It had been destroyed, undone by its own knowledge, its own ambition. And now it was nothing more than whispers in the dark, trapped in a place between worlds. The figure raised his hand again, and the room seemed to shift. The air grew thick with something else, something dark, something ancient, as if the very walls were pressing in on Samuel, trapping him in this place. The whispers grew louder still, and Samuel felt the weight of their voices, voices that had once belonged to the people who had lived here, now trapped, forever repeating the mistakes of the past. You must leave, the figure said, his voice trembling with the weight of the curse. Before you become one of us. Before you are swallowed by the dark. But it was too late. Samuel had already seen too much. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were voices, real voices, reaching out to him from the walls, from the floor beneath him, from the very stones themselves. He felt their cold fingers brushing against his skin, felt their hands pulling him toward the shadows. The last thing Samuel saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure's face, pale, hollow, his eyes burning with an unholy light. And then there was nothing. The price of knowledge. When Samuel awoke, it was not in the stone chamber he had last seen. The air around him was warm but thick with the smell of earth and decay. His head spun, and his body ached as if he had been crushed under the weight of centuries. He blinked, trying to gather his bearings, but the world around him was still shifting, blurry and indistinct. His surroundings began to take shape, and he realized with horror that he was no longer in the city of stone. He was outside, beneath an ancient, gnarled tree whose roots twisted deep into the earth like serpents. The tree loomed over him, its branches stretching wide, casting long, crooked shadows over the ground. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he wasn't alone. He turned slowly, heart pounding, and saw them. The figures from the walls, the faces from the stone carvings, were standing before him. They were not just images, not just spirits caught in the stone. They were real, or at least they seemed real. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths agape as if they were trapped in an eternal scream. They moved slowly, their feet hovering just above the ground, gliding like wraiths. Some reached out toward him, their hands trembling as though they wanted to touch him, but each time, their hands passed through his body as if he were made of smoke. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to obey. He was paralyzed by the sight before him, by the horror that seemed to echo through the air. "Who are you?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The figures didn't answer. Instead, they continued to circle around him, their eyes locked onto his, their hollow gaze never wavering. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't just voices in the wind. They were clear, distinct, coming from every direction at once. The air seemed to vibrate with their presence. "You've awakened us," the voices said, their tone chilling. "You've disturbed the silence that kept us bound." Samuel's mind raced. He had been warned by Ezekiel, by the figure who had spoken to him in the chamber. He had been warned that those who sought the city would pay a terrible price. But now, in the presence of these restless spirits, he understood the cost far too well. "What do you want from me?" Samuel asked, his voice shaking. "Why are you here?" One of the figures stepped forward, its face pale and gaunt, its eyes wide with an unspoken sorrow. It opened its mouth, but no words came. Instead, it reached out toward him, its hand passing over his face, its fingers brushing against his skin. The touch was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt. "We were once like you," the figure whispered, its voice a rasp, a sound that made Samuel's bones ache. "We sought knowledge too. We sought power beyond understanding, and in doing so we condemned ourselves." The figure's hand hovered above his heart. "The city was built on knowledge that should never have been sought. The secrets we uncovered tore us apart. And now we are bound here, trapped between worlds, until another comes to take our place." Samuel felt the weight of those words press down on him. He understood now that the lost civilization wasn't just a people who had vanished. They were a people who had been consumed by their own ambition, by their own thirst for power. And now they were paying the price. He looked around, the air thick with the voices of the lost. It wasn't just the figures that surrounded him. It was the land itself, the earth beneath him, the trees around him, all holding the memories of those who had come before. Their voices, their sorrow, their regrets. They were all part of this place, all bound to it. "You cannot escape," the figure said. "You have seen too much, learned too much. You will stay here like us until the land is satisfied. Until the price is paid." Samuel stumbled backward, his chest tight, his heart racing. He had to escape. He had to find a way out before he became one of them, before he was bound to this place forever. But the ground beneath his feet began to shift, the earth cracking open as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He felt the air around him grow heavier, as though the very land was closing in on him. The shadows stretched longer, the figures began to move faster, and their hollow eyes glowed brighter, burning with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Leave now," the figure urged, its voice pleading. "Before it is too late. Before you become part of the curse." Samuel's mind raced. He needed to act. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let himself fall victim to the curse that had claimed these lost souls. He turned and ran, his legs moving faster than they ever had before, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the land itself was against him. The trees reached out, their branches twisting like hands, grabbing at him, pulling him toward the ground. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they were chasing him, urging him to stop. The city was not letting him go. The lost civilization was not letting him escape. Samuel reached the edge of the clearing where the dark canyon lay beyond. He could hear the distant echoes of the city, the whispers of the lost, the cries of the damned. But ahead of him the path seemed clear. The canyon loomed, dark and foreboding, but there was light in the distance, the promise of safety, the hope of escape. He pushed forward, his body aching, his lungs burning, until at last he reached the edge of the canyon. He turned back one last time, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had seen, of what he had heard. And as he stood there, on the precipice of the unknown, he felt the ground beneath his feet tremble, as though the very earth was calling him back. But he didn't look back. He didn't listen. And as he stepped forward into the darkness, he knew one thing for certain. The lost civilization would never truly let him go.